Okay, great. Let's see here. All right. Wonderful. Okay, so yeah, the title of my talk here today is Generations and Generational Differences at Work. Where do we stand? And so to get us going here, I think it probably makes sense to sort of set a groundwork for what this topic really is all about. And so this idea of generational differences at work refers broadly to this notion that there are demonstrable dissimilarities between members of different groupings of successive birth cohorts, and that these differences manifest as differences or observable differences in work outcomes. And so if you kind of take a broad look at this literature, you can see studies that look at things like generational differences in job attitudes, like job satisfaction, or work values, like work ethic, different motivations, and even things like work performance that can be tied back to the generation that somebody supposedly belongs to. The implication of studying generations or focusing on generations, if we think about this sort of broadly, is that generational differences are a phenomenon that has to be actively managed in the workplace. And I would suggest that this is a pretty ubiquitous idea. If you pick up a popular business publication, the popular business and management literature is sort of rife with examples of, things that we need to be focusing on that have a generational differences sort of bent to it. And we see this also across different areas of research that exist in the organizational sciences. I would suggest that as a phenomenon, this idea of generational differences has taken on what we can call a form of functional autonomy. And so if you think about the idea of generations and generational differences, in the workplace, in the organizational sciences literature and beyond, we often take this existence of this idea of generations as sort of an assumption. We take it on face, and the influence of generational differences is seen as sort of axiomatic as a result. The basis behind this idea of generations comes from sociological theory, and specifically from early 20th century functionalist sociological theories. And so a lot of the work that we're going to talk about here is grounded in this early work, especially that was done by a sociologist named Karl Mannheim. And so according to Mannheim's theory, formative experiences shape what he refers to as this idea of collective consciousness of generations. And so the idea of a group of individuals experiencing like a war or an economic depression would perhaps give rise to the existence of a specific subgrouping or generation of individuals. And from a functionalist perspective, generations are used as explanations for broad-scale social change, which is to say cultural change. And originally, the way that this idea came to be was from a thought experiment that posed a question that was something like, would the changing of societies, would social change really be possible if there were no new generations to challenge the ideas of preceding ones? And so from the perspective of early functionalist sociologists, generations were a mechanism that shapes culture. What's really interesting about this is that a kind of a more modern take on this sort of tends to flip that explanation around. And so, for example, contemporary generations researchers say things like generations are shaped by trends in culture. And so the exact mechanism by which culture shapes generations and generations shape culture is part of the complexity of really beginning to understand what's going on when we talk about generations and generational differences. Researchers don't seem to actually understand or agree, probably is a better way to put this, on where along this sort of cycle of generations and culture we really need to begin understanding these phenomena. In the workplace, if we sort of think about kind of the idea of generational differences at work, these ideas have long been invoked to explain changes in work relevant outcomes, things like attitudes and behaviors and motives that we care about in the field of biopsychology and in organizational sciences more broadly defined. And so back early as 1960, we see work by Diamant, who argues for generation gaps in leadership and management phenomena. There's a kind of a more recent, I guess, in the broad scheme of things, work by Tulgan, who talks about, different strategies for managing members of Generation X. Even kind of core theories of organizational culture and climate talk about generations. So Shine talks about the role that generations play in transmitting organizational culture across different, essentially cohorts of people that come in and out of organizations. And so, broadly speaking, the idea of generations have been long invoked in the organizational sciences in various ways for explaining different, different phenomena that we care about. Other ways that this manifests. So the American Psychological Association, APA, since 2013 has produced a work and well-being survey that has often reported generation group comparisons for several work outcomes. I'll show you an example of that in just a second. And even IO psychologists, our own SIOP, the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, which is a Division 14 of the APA, yearly publishes a list of workforce trends. And so occasionally over the last 10 years or so, they've referred to the idea of generations and assumed generational differences as being kind of one of the top trends in the workforce, that we need to be paying attention to as IO psychologists. Here's an example of this. This is from the 2017 APA Work and Wellbeing Survey. And this is an example of this type of analysis where there's various categories like, plans to change jobs and growth and development and trends in things like stress and physical health and mental health. And these are just frequencies for responses to very specific items that are broken down at the bottom there. You can see by these three sort of broad generational groups, millennials and people from Generation X and boomers, which are kind of common labels that we apply to identifying members of different generations. These sort of ideas are not just present in sort of the way that professional organizations present themselves. Business schools, for example, require courses in generational differences. And so this is actually a screenshot from the course catalog for the business school at my university. And they offer a 1-credit course to MBA students. That's actually a required course called Generational Differences. And so we're baking this into the curriculum that we are presenting to MBA students specifically at some level here. And so I'm guessing you've seen things like this. Millennials are doing something, generations are doing something. They're killing the golf industry and they're killing Major League Baseball, and they're just wreaking havoc on the marmalade industry, and the beer industry and wine and napkins. So it's not just foods, it's food related products. And you've seen the headlines about avocados, and I guess we could throw Canadian tourism in there too. These sort of headlines are sort of ubiquitous. We see lots of evidence that people from different generations are really causing perhaps massive changes in the way that various industries are operating. What's interesting about these types of headlines is that they're really nothing new. And so here's a series of examples of headlines that sort of highlight similar moral panics over time. And so you can see, headlines from 1907 that suggest that teddy bears are dooming the race, and that jazz and movies and motor cars are blamed for wild youth. Bicycles are blamed for youth's insanity over here. The box in the middle that I have the red square around, this is one of the first examples historically that I can find where we're seeing kind of a blaming of youth for changing issues at work. And so this is a headline that suggests that these messengers want more money, and they're if you look at the bottom there, they're saying that their habit towards reading dime novels, which are like cheap kind of pulp fiction novels in the early 1900s, is probably responsible for them wanting more money at work. And so this is nothing new, blaming perhaps youth on youth for sort of the ills that society faces. If you go to the bookstore, you can find various books that give you advice about what to do about generations at work. And so on the left panel here, you see this book called Managing the Millennials, which is a book about how to manage members of the millennial workforce. On the right here, we have a book called Millennials Who Manage, which is actually a book for millennials who've assumed managerial positions. Advice about how to be a manager if you happen to be a millennial. My favorite thing about this is that they're written by the exact same person. If you go to Google and you type in managing generational differences, you'll get thousands of results. In this case, about over 7,500 results. And so, for example, you can find entire consultancies that are dedicated to this idea of, oh my gosh, we actually need to do something to manage different generations at work. And so, for example, a big part of what they sell are training programs about how to manage generational differences or how to manage members of different generations differently. And you can see, for example, a bit of the curriculum that's listed here about such a training that might occur. And so with all of this groundwork laid, I think the question we probably need to ask ourselves at this point is, what influence does this notion of generational differences actually have on the processes that we care about as organizational researchers and practitioners? What does generational differences mean for the type of work that we do? And I've hinted a little bit perhaps at my answer to this, but to put it a little bit more clearly, the answer is not much. A lot of the work that I've focused my attention on has called into question a number of the assumptions that we have made, both theoretically about generations and the research that's actually been conducted that purports to study generational differences and various sort of related phenomena. And so what we're going to do next is sort of walk through some of the arguments that research on generational differences uses to sort of support the idea of studying generational differences. And then we're going to walk through some of the issues that are associated with the way in which this has been studied to try to kind of lay out a little bit more about the argument that these things probably don't really have that much bearing on processes in the workplace. And so let's start by sort of playing devil's advocate against my point that generational differences probably don't really matter all that much. So let's think about some of the arguments that are used to support the existence of generational differences. And so the first argument that's commonly made here, or that's pointed out when people start talking about these ideas, is that the nature of work is changing. The nature of work is changing not only with regard to the content of work that's being done, but really the makeup of the workforce. And so globally, the workforce, and as a result, organizations are increasingly becoming older and more age diverse. And so that, coupled with the fact that the way that work is being done, that in and of itself is sort of a dynamic phenomenon. The nature of the work itself is changing as well. And so there's no doubt that work is changing. When people invoke generational explanations around the idea of the changing nature of work, theories of generational differences are often invoked to explain those types of changes, and often it's used in a couple of different ways. And so research, for example, might argue that generations or differences between generations are an antecedent to the changes that we see in the workplace. So for example, the argument has been made that generational differences explain differences in career patterns that are manifesting in the changing nature of work kind of space. We also see sort of the opposite argument made often as well, so that generational differences are a reflection of the change that we see in the nature of work itself. And so the argument has been made that members of different generations actually react differently, for example, to broader scale socioeconomic instability, like economic recessions and things like that. The second argument here is that, not only is work changing, but the world is changing. Okay, and so generational categories give us one means of understanding how sociocultural phenomena manifest as age-related differences that might influence individual level behaviors, broadly defined. And so we still, though, see examples in which even generational researchers kind of argue against that point. So, for example, this quote from Jean Twenge says that, generational cutoffs are generally pretty arbitrary in that they allow us to define and describe people despite like obvious limitations of using what they call a bright line when a fuzzy line might be actually closer to the truth. One argument that we've made in our work around this idea that the world is changing and that generations give us some means of understanding that offers a really social constructivist perspective on this idea of generational differences. And so from this perspective, what we argue is that generations serve really as a sense-making mechanism. Generational differences and generations in and of themselves don't really exist in any sort of objective sense. So the argument here is that really what we're dealing with are social constructs that have some utility. There's some use here because they explain the complexities that are associated with changing societies against what is really a complicated issue, which is all the intricacies of human development that we observe on a day-to-day basis. So from that perspective, thinking in terms of generations is pretty useful in that it makes a relatively complex issue a little bit less complex. So the process of aging is a really dynamic and complex issue. And so from that perspective, generations give us, some meaning that we can attach to these observations and perceptions of age-related differences that we witness when we have social interactions with people who might be of a different age than us. So where does this all kind of leave us? And so let's think about some empirical evidence for generational differences. Despite their sort of popularity and ubiquity, there's actually very little empirical research that is conducted on purported generational differences at work. And so although it's about 10 years old, this kind of well-cited meta-analysis by David Costanza and colleagues only considered, or was only able to consider 20 studies of generational difference phenomena at work. And their conclusion was that the relationship between generational membership and work-related outcomes are moderate to small and essentially zero in many cases, suggesting that there's not much, empirical research-based evidence to actually support the idea of generational differences. In 2017, my colleagues and I conducted a qualitative systematic review of the idea of leadership in generations, and we were only able to locate about 18 studies that were published in indexed journals. And our conclusion from this research was that there was no evidence to support generational differences in leadership phenomena. All right, so with some groundwork laid in terms of what generational differences at work are, and a bit of a discussion on sort of the theoretical arguments that are often used to support the idea of generational differences, let's take a bit of a deeper dive into the arguments that are opposed to these ideas. And so we're going to talk about a three-pronged argument against the idea of generational differences at work. We're going to talk about some logical concerns that are associated with the operationalization and study of generations. We'll talk about some research methods concerns, and then we'll talk about some of the concerns in the actual empirical literature as well. And so from a logical perspective, I would strongly suggest that generational theorizing is a really flawed model of behavior. It's a really top-down, deterministic way of conceptualizing, behavior at work, behavior outside of work generally, in that it assumes that all members of a given generation tend to act in the same way. Okay. From this perspective, it's really reductionist as well. And so we're losing a whole bunch of the nuance that's associated with the process of aging when we distill this otherwise complex process into these simple generational units. One of my favorite, if not somewhat pedantic quotes about this comes from Leibniz. It's in Latin, I apologize, natura non facit saltus, which translates into this idea that nature does not take jumps, does not make jumps. And so the logic of generations is that, there are big jumps between members of different, generational groups, which, we wouldn't make that argument about other sorts of developmental processes outside of like human behavior. And so that's why I sort of invoke that quote here when we're talking about these logical concerns. Some other sort of logical concerns here, if we're trying to study generations or broadly apply generational explanations, even just sort of day to day, it involves thinking about or exploring relationships among variables that are defined and ultimately in a research context measured at different conceptual levels of analysis. And so I think we need to just understand that generations are typically understood at the group level. They define groups of people, but that work outcomes, things like attitudes and values and performance, are all individual level phenomena. And so there's a couple of different logical fallacies that we tend to fall victim to when we're thinking about how group level behavior or group level phenomena apply to individuals. The first are called atomistic fallacies. And this is when we make inferences regarding variability across groups that are based on individual level data. And so if we try to compare individuals to one another and draw conclusions about group level behavior from those individual level observations, we run the risk of falling into the sort of atomistic fallacy trap. If we sort of flip that around a little bit, there's also this idea of an ecological fallacy, where we make inferences regarding phenomena at the group level, we make inferences regarding phenomena at the individual level based on group level data. And so generally, this is the sort of process that is typically invoked when we take a generational label and we apply it to an individual. So we say, oh, well, you're a member of this generation. We assume that every member in that generation sort of gets clustered together, but there's no real reason to do that. So beyond the logical concerns, there's a number of empirical concerns too. And so I've alluded to this a little bit, but there's really meager evidence to support the existence of generational differences phenomena. And so, as I suggested in the meta-analysis by Costanza and colleagues, they failed to find support for generational differences across a number of different work outcomes. A few different corollary papers have reached the same conclusions, one by Stassen and colleagues in 2016 and one by Zabel and colleagues in 2017. Which was a meta-analysis of generational differences in work ethic endorsement. A well-cited review article from 2014 concluded that evidence has been sparse for some variables and inconsistent for others. There remains a great deal of variation in methodologies and reporting of findings, making it difficult to draw definitive conclusions from the research. And although that paper is about 8 years old at this point, I think the sentiment that's shared here still very much stands. Some other empirical concerns here. A different paper by David Costanza and colleagues studied how various common ways of operationalizing generational differences in statistical models that are used for analyzing data would lead to different conclusions. And so there's a handful of common approaches that are used to study generations. We'll talk about some of these today in a little bit more detail. So for example, this idea of cross-temporal meta-analysis, we'll come back to that one. There's another approach called cross-classified hierarchical linear modeling. And then there's what are just kind of more traditional cross-sectional analyses. And the nature of these are not of that much importance right now. The difference is that you could take the same data set and apply, very common models that are used to model these differences, and you could reach very different conclusions on the basis of which model you selected. So the findings from this study from 2017 suggest that the methods that are commonly used to study generations don't converge with each other, which means that any conclusions that one would draw regarding generational differences are in part dependent on the approach that the analysis takes. They're dependent on the specific approach to statistical analysis that the analyst chooses, which is a kind of an obvious, I think, liability in this area of research. Some other methodological concerns here. So generational differences research typically uses data that are collected at a single point in time. And so, You could imagine a research design, what we typically call as a cross-sectional research design, where a researcher sends a survey out to a sample of individuals and asks them some questions about, topics that are of relevance to their study, maybe things around job attitudes or something like that. And then tries to tie, observations of, job attitudes back to generational membership. The problem with this type of approach that uses this single time point research design is that these sorts of cross-sectional methods can't be used to address questions about generations. So the most commonly employed method of studying generational differences can't actually tell us anything about the presence of generational differences. And the reason for that is because in a single time point research design, we're going to be conflating several sources of variation: chronological age, what's called contemporaneous period effects, and then actual birth cohort effects, which are the effects that we typically take as evidence for generational differences. And so this is fairly complicated, but it's easy to understand if I give you an example. And so if you consider that if we know what year it is, and I would say, like, in general, we would all agree that it's 2022, which may be hard to believe after 3 years of a pandemic, but yes, it is 2022. So we know the current year, and if we know someone's age, so for example, 38, then the birth cohort associated with that individual is determined. It's 1984, all right? So what that means is that in a single time point study, the year of data collection is generally held constant. And so what that results in is a situation in which any conclusions that are drawn concerning birth cohort effects, which, to be clear, is the evidence that's typically taken for the presence or absence of generational differences, could be due to either birth cohort or chronological age. Because they're confounded with each other, each is an equally likely soon to be causal mechanism that's present here. And then it's on to the theory that we have to parse these confounded sources of variation. So how do we account for this confounding? This is where we get to the point where we start to group together members of different birth cohorts into these artificial generational groupings. And so we create these synthetic generational groupings to avoid directly confounding the age and the period and the cohort effects of one another. And that's the result. That's what results in these generational grouping effects. Now, the problem with this, even though this seems like it would make sense to do on face, is that there's really sporadic agreement about how to do this. And so this is an image taken from a paper that I wrote. This is actually from a paper I wrote in 2017, where all that we did in this case was just to go through the studies that were included in this review, and we coded the birth year ranges that were associated with different labeled generational groups. And so you can see, like, the birth year ranges that are associated at the bottom of the screen is probably easiest to see here with generation Y, or what are sometimes called millennials in the literature. And you can see that just the ranges in terms of the endpoints of those bars there vary to some extent, between these groups. And so, for example, you can even see cases in which members of one generation in one study would be classified as members of another generation in another study. And so there's really little agreement in the literature about how to actually start and end these different generational groups, which again means that that's largely up to the analysts, which again is another one of these sort of limitations of this approach to studying these phenomena. Another typical approach that's used here is what are called cross-temporal methods. And so a common approach to this is a cross-temporal meta-analysis. And what these analyses try to do is to hold age constant across time. And so, for example, we'd look at independent samples of 18-year-olds to hold age constant who were sampled in 1990 and 2000 and 2010, so on and so forth. And so there's been a number of different studies that have used this methodology. The problem with trying to hold age constant is that if you move one of those variables into the constant range, you're going to confound the other two sources of variance with each other. And so in this case, a cross-temporal analysis, much like with the cross-sectional analyses that we just talked about, is going to confound the cohort and the period effects with one another. And so again, just like with cross-sectional data collection, each of these cohort and period effects are going to be equally likely causes of the observed variation that we observe. And as a result, even though they're well cited in the literature, these cross-temporal approaches can't draw valid conclusions about generational differences. Age and period and cohort effects are going to be ubiquitous in the study of these sorts of time-related, age-related phenomena at work. And the challenge here is that it's really hard conceptually sometimes to separate out what are cohort and period effects, and they're really commonly mistaken for one another. So this is a screenshot that I grabbed from a tweet that I saw, at some point. We'll just keep it anonymous for now. But you can see that the heading here is generational differences. And it says in 1978, 72% of American teens had a summer job. And then it says in the Bureau of Labor Statistics says it's fallen to 42% today. And then they suggest that job availability and summer school are some reasons why. Okay, job availability and summer school are period effects. But these are being attributed to generational differences because we conflate cohort and period effects all the time. A little bit more of a background on my research in this area. In 2020, I wrote a paper with a couple of colleagues, including David Costanza, who I've mentioned a couple times today, where we did a review and critique of cross-temporal approaches to studying generations. And I've already sort of briefly described to you what a cross-temporal meta-analysis is. We used a specific type of statistical analysis and methodology here called a Monte Carlo study, which is essentially a study where we are able to manipulate features of population characteristics and see how they affect inferences that we would make from this type of analysis strategy. In this particular paper, what we were able to demonstrate is that in many cases, the cohort effect that is being represented, which is to say the actual generational effect that's being represented in cross-sectional approaches to studying generations, is misestimated, which is to say, in some cases it's overestimated, and in some cases it's underestimated by a factor of up to about 8 times in the worst case scenario with regard to the specific simulations that we conducted. And so as a result of this, because cross-temporal methods are commonly used, their conclusions from those studies should be strongly questioned. The other issue here is that because these methods draw on correlations between group level phenomena, they are a specific case of that ecological fallacy that I mentioned a few minutes ago. And so this is a long acknowledged statistical misspecification. And so I know that I've thrown a lot of statistical terminology out here, and I'm talking at a level of thinking about very specific types of approaches and methodologies and models. What does this all mean is sort of the more important bit, perhaps. But the takeaway from the empirical issues here, it really boils down to this. Nearly every study of generational differences in work outcomes has adopted either a cross-sectional or a cross-temporal methodology for identifying and studying these ideas, these phenomena. Because both of these strategies can't unambiguously identify generational differences phenomena, it could be strongly argued that there has actually never been a study of generational differences in work outcomes. We really don't know very much about these ideas. And what it really boils down to is the fact that we don't have a methodology that allows us to unambiguously study these things. And so what does this mean? Where do we stand with regard to these ideas? If we can put this kind of differently, what influence does the notion of generational differences actually have on the processes that we care about as organizational researchers and practitioners? And it's not an easy answer. It's the type of question that makes us balance out sort of the logic of these ideas with the actual evidence that we have in support of them. And so the statement that I would make, and the position that I generally take, is that we don't actually have sufficient evidence currently for the existence of generations or generational differences as a result that would warrant all of the attention that these ideas receive in research and practice. And so again, it's a situation where we need to balance out what is sort of the logical arguments against generations, what are the logical arguments for generations? Do we have a methodology that would allow us to study these things in a way that would lead to valid conclusions? And then what does the evidence actually say? In this case, it's the situation where I think that the evidence against the existence of generations is sort of the thing that wins out here. And so to take this a step further, I might suggest to you that generational differences are a management fad. These are sort of fashionable and novel ideas that are unsubstantiated by actual research. And so the advice that I generally give here is that I would strongly caution against applying generational differences to explain any noted shifts in work-related processes, really broadly defined. And I want to mention too that, I mean, this isn't just a function of how this operates in the workplace. The application of generational logic to understand any sort of social phenomenon is going to be a misguided effort in a best case scenario. In the worst case scenario, what this does is set up a situation where we're going to be committing what I've called generationalism. And so generationalism, like any other ism that exists, is a belief that all members of a given generation are going to be possessing characteristics or abilities that are specific to that generation. And that's done especially so that we can distinguish them as either inferior or superior to members of another generation. It's not too difficult to find examples of generationalism in the real world. It's a very common strategy that's used, frankly, to thinly veil otherwise broadly ageist sentiments. And so, for example, this is a screenshot. You can see that I've sort of blanked out the branding and the names here just to sort of preserve some anonymity. But this is a screenshot that I took from LinkedIn, which is sort of a great place to find examples of this kind of stuff. And it says, drop your old recruitment methods and implement these simple strategies to effectively target millennial talent. Download to start today. So this is like a white paper ebook in this case that you could download for 7 tips to recruit millennials. And so right off the bat, you can see that this is the sort of tailored HR strategy that's relying on generational thinking that maybe at the best case is just misguided. But if you look at the first comment down here that I put the red box around, someone has commented like, okay, just be okay with hiring people who will take your training and leave in a year for a competitor, which is right. This is this common stereotype that, people from younger generations are hopping jobs all the time or something like this. And so this is just one example of many, many that I could share. What do we do about this? I mean, here's the challenge, right? A lot of the work that I've done on aging at work promotes what we call like a lifespan perspective, which is instead of thinking about age as these sort of groups of individuals that we broadly label as generations, what if we took a lifespan perspective and thought about, the entirety of one's work life as a continuum? And how could we, tailor policies and, for example, like leadership strategies for workers of all ages that support an age diverse workforce and that support individual workers across the entirety of their lifespan? And so this is an example of a bit of a graphic that we've put together about how we can help leaders understand the nature of aging workforces and how to support age diverse members of their teams. And so things like recognizing differences in age related abilities that have nothing to do with generations, they just have to do with the fact that as people get older, there's physical and cognitive changes that are associated with the process of aging. You can also, acknowledge dynamics and things like personality and other individual differences that are associated with aging, and understand age-related differences in life situations as people move from, being parents to having other caregiving responsibilities, perhaps as they take care of older members of their family as well. But also designing work systems that allow for optimal integration of age-related dynamics. And so there are things about the aging workforce that we can harness so that we can actually sort of, take advantage of some of the benefits that are associated with having a more experienced workforce that are often neglected when we start to think about things in terms of, broad age-related categories. And so I'll end it there and open the floor for conversation and discussion. This is one of my favorite cartoons about this because it does bring up the age period cohort confounding that I referred to. And so, tonight are millennials killing the joint replacement industry, right? And you can see here, like, this is the operation rate per 100,000. And yeah, millennials are definitely not getting knee or hip replacements, right? This is the stats pet peeve with people mixing up cohort and age effects in this case. These are all, complex mechanisms, and it's really easy to, attribute one to the other is, I guess, what I'll say about that. So yeah, with that, I'll stop the share and I guess open the floor up to questions, if that's okay. Or I don't know, Clemente, I'll throw it back to you.
No, sounds good. Does anyone have any questions, comments? Yeah, Elise.
Okay, I'm not muted. And now you can see me too. First, yeah, I thank you. I actually enjoyed the presentation and agree with you. And before you started, I was thinking there's so many variables that determine, people's, like you're saying, relationships to each other, to work, to whatever, in terms of, cultural, economic, ethnic, all kind of, variables. So there's that. And when you extrapolate out one thing, that also feels challenging in terms of research. And the other thing I was thinking was how this phenomenon of different generations is so embedded now, though, in our culture, So even as you're speaking, and I agree with you, I was thinking, well, I'm this generation, or, it just is so embedded. And I was thinking that some of that is also, obviously that there's a lot of money made off of that, right? There's a lot of commercialism. And so anyway, I just meant those two things about so many variables that people leave out in these discussions, and also how it's so prominent now in our culture. And I don't know if you had any thoughts about either or both.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about both. I think about those two issues a lot. The thing that I always tell people about age and aging is that it's one of the few, well, for the lucky among us, it's one of the few universal experiences. So if we're lucky, we're all going to get to grow old, right? But that process cuts across all of the things that you mentioned, socioeconomic strata, genders, other demographics that are associated with ethnicities. And there's all these sort of intersectional complexities that are just left out in conversations about, oh, millennials do this, or boomers do this, or whatever. And so it ignores it, and a tremendous, it's straightforward and it's easy to communicate and it makes a headline, but we lose out on a lot of the complexity and nuance. It's unsatisfying to see an argument for, one thing without ignoring another. So the argument that, millennials can't buy houses, well, that's as much an economic argument as it is an argument about growing up in an economic environment that maybe is precluding you from doing that. But yes, it's the second point. It's a massive industry. I mean, there are whole consultancies that are associated with, helping organizations solve these problems. The sort of anecdote that I always like to make, and it's something that I honestly do, but whenever I'm at the airport, which I haven't been doing very much recently, but certainly in times past when I used to travel more, you can walk through a bookstore at the airport and find 2 or 3 books generally about these phenomena. And so they're very popular. And yeah, it's the worst case scenario is that this is causing ageism. The best case scenario is that you're just misleading people about what they should be focusing attention on at work. And it's challenging. And I've seen, I know you're all in higher ed policy at some level. I've seen a lot of higher ed policy kind of built around this stuff too. And so even at my own university, there's a lot of talk about what does this generation of college students want? And so we're doing things like, allowing certain dorms to allow people to have dogs because that's what members of this generation want. And it's like, well, is it, or is it not? Like, why does it have to be a generational thing? There's a lot of that kind of conversation to be had as well. So.
Just one last point, I'm sorry.
Sure. No.
And then I'll stop. I actually direct career services at one of the graduate schools here. And in career services, though, this conversation comes up a lot.
Mhm.
It's very much integrated into, kind of what the different generations want, and also the world of work,
Yeah.
right? So it's so, and I always felt a little, what's the word, resistant to it, I suppose, because people would talk about, oh yeah, well that's the generation. I'm like, well, that's not my experience. I find, people I work with hardworking and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I just wanted to. But
I've had that conversation myself. I know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and to your point, at least, that's one of the primary purposes of the CUNY IOPN. Because at least in my opinion, I think higher ed, even career services, tends to be very best practices oriented, but not necessarily evidence-based practice, and they're not synonymous. And I think I always want to kind of be mindful of that we should be leveraging, the best available evidence in making our decisions and policies and practices. Yeah. And kind of another point, I know Costanza likes using this example with respect to generational groups. It's not that millennials, or I guess now Gen Z, are narcissistic, is that all young people are narcissistic.
Yeah.
So the quote unquote boomers, when they were 18, they were narcissistic themselves, because it's an age effect, not a cohort effect.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Any other questions, comments? Now, while you think of any other potential comments or questions, I did want to throw this out there as well, because there is some literature that focuses on generational groups as a social identity. So not so much that it actually exists, but it exists in our minds, right? We will it to existence, like Costanza says. But focusing on how these social identities actually make us engage in outgroup biases. And that's why we have these terms like okay boomer, or these other kind of negative sayings that we have towards certain individuals, or individuals that we perceive to be in certain generational groups.
Well, and that's actually why I started studying this stuff, was because I had a few notable experiences where I had students in the classroom who would say things like, well, I'm a member of this generation, and so I want this. And so there was this strong identification component that's associated with this stuff, which is fascinating because, and this is an argument that I've made in my work, which is like, if you tell somebody that they are entitled and narcissistic because they are a member of this generation, then they will adopt those ideas and they'll start to act in that way. And so, nobody was standing up and saying, well, I'm a millennial, so I'm entitled. It was more like, well, I've been told that as a millennial, I need lots of feedback. And so, well, everybody likes feedback. That's not necessarily generational, but yeah, that's a very much, something that I've kind of thought about a lot too.
Then we have a comment, Court, in the chat. Moving to remote work in March shined a bright light on generational differences when it comes to technology.
So I wanted to elaborate on that. Thanks, Clemente. So it's, hearing that we should never typify or stereotype a generation. Absolutely.
Yep.
I'm Gen X, so I'm in the middle between the boomers and the whatever the current one, Gen Z, right? So I feel like I'm not sometimes relevant to the students I teach in FYS. And then what my comment about like going remote, and I'm thinking about how generational sort of stereotypes held us back a little bit with CUNY. It took a pandemic for CUNY to give any sort of permission to work remotely, right? So it's an interesting balance. And I see some of my colleagues where we've discussed at the water cooler about how sometimes it's easy to feel held back because of like what the group can't do collectively. But I also wonder, what am I contributing to that with the new generation?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I agree with you to some extent. The sort of people's experiences with this sort of stuff come into play a lot, right? And so like if you spent most of your career working in a face-to-face environment, which then was like interrupted. I know that, especially among some of my older colleagues, they had a really hard time with the transition to remote. But that wasn't because necessarily of anything generational. I think it was mostly just that if you have this experience, imagine you've spent 30 years teaching a course and you've done it one way for so long, and I'm not exaggerating here, that this is the conversation that what we were having, which is like, I've always done it this way. How am I possibly going to do it some other way? You know, you have the burden perhaps of that experience on top of you. And I think that's more of an age phenomenon than it is necessarily generational. But yeah, certainly technology is one of those common areas where this sort of thing is discussed, which is, you know, people might have different experiences or different comfort levels when it comes to adopting new technologies or using new technologies. So, and that might be age related as well. So.
Yeah, and to your point, Court, so prior to coming back to career services, I helped manage a dual enrollment program. So I worked specifically with high school students. And during the pandemic, so obviously we had some faculty members who had kind of that difficulty transitioning to the hybrid or remote work, but so did our students, right? And I remember everyone at the CUNY Central office talking like, they don't understand. I'm like, this is the most technologically savvy generation, right? They're Gen Z. They've grown up with iPhones, right? They were born with them in their hands practically. And yet they had probably more difficulty with the transition than some of the older individuals.
Right. Well, and it's even more interesting too, because like the technology that they've grown up with is maybe different than that what people grew up with 20 or 30 years ago. And so like one challenge that I have in education right now is that students don't really get the computer training that they need to be successful in. I teach a lot of statistics courses that use programming languages. And so that's a hurdle for them, where it wouldn't be a hurdle for people that came out of you know, primary or secondary education 30 years ago, because that was sort of how computers worked, you know what I mean? So like, yes, they have access to iPhones and iPads and all this technology, but it's not the same sort of basic understanding of how these systems operate. And so that creates its own little, you know, experience gap in understanding some of these technology processes. So it's almost like it's come full circle. So yeah.
All right, any final comments, anyone? Questions? Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Robinson, who's the other co-chair.
Yes, thank you, Clemente. Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Rudolph, for coming in and just kind of sharing a little bit of your insight as well. Wanted to share some wrap-up stuff before we head off. The recording will be in some suggested readings on our website as well. Clemente, maybe we could throw the website on the chat. We will have a couple more IO talks coming out throughout the semester, so we'll be putting out more details for that as well. And overall, thank you so much for everyone for joining in by and sharing a little bit of your details. Take care, everyone.